want to show you how to do my modified flat drawstring bind off. This is a bind off that I use for all of my hats. It helps to make less bulk up here near the crown when we gather it off of the loom. Years ago I first saw a similar technique done by Jeannie Phillips, and through the years other people have made different modifications to it to suit them. This is just a combination of what I like to do. So it's my modified flat drawstring bind off. The first thing that you do to do this bind off, excuse me, you need to go around your loom and do 2 rows of E-wrap knit 2 pegs, purl 2 pegs. So I've already done that. On this hat I have done E-wrap 2, purl 2, E-wrap 2, purl 2. So you do that pattern the entire way around the loom for 1 row, that exact same pattern again for a 2nd row, and that's where we're at right now. So I've got my 2 setup rows done. You take your working yarn then and you need to go around the loom and cut it to where you have enough tail that will go around the loom at least once. So that's what I've done already, is I've cut that tail. Then you take a separate piece of yarn and again you measure around the loom and cut again so that you have a second separate piece of yarn that is the length of the loom. Okay, so step 2, with our second separate piece of yarn, make a slip knot. I just don't do that right now. Make a slip knot, and we're going to place this slip knot on peg 1. And all this does is just anchor the yarn there so that I can pick up some stitches and take them off of the loom without losing them. Okay, so my first series of loops that come off of the loom and onto my separate piece of yarn are going to be all of the pegs that I had purled. So if you remember, we did knit 2, purl 2. So I'm going to start with, actually it's peg number 3 because my peg 1 and peg 2 were E-wrap knits. So I'll start with peg number 3 and I'm going to take peg 3 and peg 4, take their loops off of the loom and onto my separate strand of yarn. You can feed this yarn through a yarn needle and do it that way, where you just take the needle up through. I never seem to have a needle when I want one, and this is just as easy for me. So what I do is, so peg 1, peg 2, peg 3 is the first one I'm going to do. I act as though I'm going to purl, but I just pull that working yarn clear up through, and that just fed my yarn up through the loop. And I'm going to do it for the second peg that was purled. Okay, so those 2 stitches are now secure on my separate piece of yarn, so I can lift them off of the loom. Okay, so again I had knit, knit, purl, purl. I have 2 knits, so I'm going to skip those and put the working yarn behind and go to my 2 purls. Same thing, I'm going to feed those 2 stitches onto my yarn, just secure them there. And now I can lift those 2 stitches off of the loom. Okay, so we have knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl. Again, these 2 are knits, so I'm going to pass those over. I'm going to slip the working yarn behind it. I'm going to go to my 2 purls and I'm going to take those off onto my separate strand of yarn here. And then I can lift them off of the loom. It's your call whether you lift them all off as you go along like I'm doing right now, or if you want to go through and feed the yarn through first and then go back around. It's your choice how you do that. I'm going to shut the camera off for a second. Go ahead, finish that, and we'll come back. Alright, I have come around the loom and I have lifted off the 2 purl stitches. I'm down to the last 2 purl stitches here, so I'm going to lift those off of the loom. Again, I feed that separate yarn tail up through and lift them off. If you remember, we had placed a slip knot here on peg 1, so I'm going to lift that slip knot off. So this is my separate piece of yarn, and you can see on the inside of my loom here, all of the purled stitches are now off the loom and they're held together with that separate strand of yarn. And I like to go ahead and just tie this in a little bow so I don't accidentally lose any of my stitches. Don't tie it in a knot, just tie it in a bow, because you're going to have to cinch those two pieces of yarn up tight. All right, so now the only stitches I have left on my loom are the 2 E-wraps. So with the tail that is attached to the hat, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to go around the loom and lift those 2 stitches off and put them on, secure them onto my yarn tail. So this is the first stitch that was knit and the second stitch. Whoops. There we go. And I can lift those 2 stitches off of the loom. Put the working yarn behind the pegs and come to the next 2 knit stitches and do the same thing. Pull the tail up through, pull the tail up through, and lift those 2 stitches off of the loom because they're now secure on this tail. They're not going to go anywhere. They will not unravel. Okay, I'm going to shut off the camera here and I will go around and come back to you when we are at the end. So hang on one sec, we'll be back. Okay, I have lifted all but 2 of the knit stitches off of the loom. So I need to go ahead and feed the yarn up through these 2 and get them lifted off the loom as well. And lift those off of the loom. And ta-da, my hat is no longer on the loom. All right, hopefully you can see here, I've got my inside set of purl stitches, and there's the separate strand of yarn, and I'm calling them the inside because they're on the inside of my hat. And then this is the yarn tail that I just pulled the knit stitches off. What I want to do is I'm going to cinch up those purl stitches on the inside, and then we cinch up the knit stitches on the outside, and that helps to gather up the fabric. So I'm going to turn the hat inside out. All these lovely tails I have to weave in later. And here's my the inside of my hat. Here is the little bow I did, you can see. So these are my purl stitches. I'm going to take that yarn and you just snug it up. Okay. So these are all my purl stitches that were snugged up, and I just tie it off in a square knot. I'll weave in the ends later, but I cinch that up as tight as I can. So I go left over right, right over left, and that makes a square knot. And then I just knot one more time for good measure. Okay, and now I'll have these tails I need to weave in. Let's flip it back to the right side of the hat, the outside. Okay, now you see all my real loose stitches here. These real loose stitches were all the knit stitches, and so I'm just going to snug those babies up tight. And I'm going to have to stop the camera because I do use a yarn needle at this time, and I feed this back through and make my knot on the inside of the hat. So let me go get a yarn needle and we'll finish this up. Alright, let me grab my yarn needle out of here. And I'm just going to secure my strand of yarn onto my yarn needle. Alright. So again, we're back here. This is the outside of the hat. I have cinched it up, and I'm just going to feed this yarn down through the hole. I guess I could have used a crochet hook too to pull the yarn through, but to me a yarn needle's just as easy. There, so now my yarn is to the center of the hat, because again I'm going to have to weave in all of these tails, and I'd rather do it on the inside of the hat than the outside. So I'm going to snug this up good and tight. See how that looks? Snug it up good and tight, and I just grab one of these tails that's already been knotted, and I'm going to do another square knot. So left over right, snug it up good and tight, right over left, And then one more for good measure. Take my needle back off the yarn or I'll lose it. And again, I'll have to weave in all these tails, but ta-da! There is my modified flat drawstring bind off.